So we continue to reflect on the third anniversary of the 2021 civil unrest, where 354 people lost their lives. The violence and looting also caused severe infrastructural damage, resulting in loss of business and jobs. But let's look at how far the recovery process has come for some businesses, especially in the townships. Let's bring in the founder of Township Entrepreneurship Alliance, Bulelani Balabala. Bulelani, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that you obviously have been supporting and working with township businesses for many years, particularly in the Gauteng area. Take us back to July 2021 and the memories that stand out for you around that time. There was a sense that there wasn't a business that wasn't affected in some communities.
Thank you so much, Naledi, to you and your team for having me on the platform. I think just taking a couple of steps back to that very day, a very tragic and painful moment. But I think, for me, a moment I've always, as a doomsday prophet, have always said is going to come, because in an unequal economy, it's a melting pot for anything to sort of happen. We're one of the most unequal economies that you'll ever find in the world, where the gap between the very wealthy and the poor grows wider and wider each day. And that in itself, I think on the backbone of the lack of service delivery, and I guess at the time, at the height of all these corruption scandals that were coming up, and the frustration that, people were going through because they were unable to participate in any economic activity, due to the result of your lockdowns and so on and so forth. So that's the biggest challenge, and that's what we saw. And I think, to date, it remains one of the most painful, visible sides of, what could happen what could happen at a larger scale when we don't take care of our unemployed youth, and we don't take care of these townships that remain consistently ignored and not supported in the way that they need to.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you raise around inequality, right? Because I think part of the debate back in 2021 was whether or not we're seeing desperate communities that are taking up the opportunity to grab what they can to feed their families versus it being seen as pure criminality. Where do you, I suppose, draw that line between it being desperate communities and when it, in your eyes, started to just look like plain criminality?
Here's the big thing is in any move and in any action move, and that actionable move being a move for good, there'll always be elements of criminality or elements of bad. So I'm not necessarily saying that the looting was a good thing. I think that's where, as a principled individual and as a principled country, that's where we sort of put our principles to the side. But it's like that quotation that due to be quoted, I think, by President Thabo Mbeki, if I'm not mistaken, consistently, saying that, if the child who's in the village is not taken care of, he will burn the school in order to feel the warmth of that school. And I think what it is at the end of the day, it's the ripple effect of where we are as a country, and pushing people to that particular point. Obviously, when things like that happen, there'll always be a criminal element that always wants to jump in and always wants to take advantage and wreak deeper anarchy than what we're actually supposed to be seeing.
And unfortunately, some of the rioting, the raiding, the looting was taking place. It wasn't just the big retailers that we saw the images of them being looted, but it was spaza shops, right? Mom and pop businesses that were also impacted, correct?
Yeah, no, definitely. It was your mom and pop businesses that got affected, literally across the board. Through that particular time, we got an opportunity to support, I think it was 320 small businesses between Gauteng and KZN. But but when we put out the call, we had a heavy influx of entries, and not entries per se, but of requests for support from individuals who were selling food on the side of the road, two individuals who had established brick and mortar businesses who had to let go of 20 to 30 employees, right? So this then cut across the board. in that particular time. And I think, the sentiment from some of the entrepreneurs as well they felt a sense of, my business in and itself, there was no need for it. Didn't even get looted. It just got burned down, you know. And that's the big frustration, to say that with a frustrated community, but also with elements of criminality, jealousy, envy, and hate within the communities that we operate in, you render yourself when such an event occurs. It positions you for someone to express exactly how they feel about you.
Talk to me about then what the recovery process would have looked like, because when you're talking about a spaza shop, for instance, that has been burned to the ground, how does that business recover, if at all? I mean, how are there businesses that simply have not bounced back since July 2021 in areas like Tembisa and Alexander, for instance?
Yeah, no, you know what? I mean, when you sort of look at, I think, firstly, what does recovery look like? At that particular time, recovery, I mean, when you were an entrepreneur and you were faced with whatever you were faced with, recovery was one of the last things on your mind because you were reeling, but also the first thing on your mind because you had no other solution but to get the business back on. And I guess, call it the sheer resilience of South African businesses. To a degree, I call it the sheer trauma of South African businesses, because at the end of the day, you do not have a moment to actually recover, to take in the moment, to think, to sit back, because you're chasing payment, you're chasing month end, you're chasing your debt, your deadline, to ensure that you're able to consistently, service all of your debts at the end of the day, because the creditors at the end of the day are not as lenient to small businesses or just to individuals in general. So you don't have that moment. So, I mean, I call it a trauma response to a degree, right, to a situation. Instead of responding in the normal humane manner, you're going to respond in a, what am I going to do next? How am I going to make it? And to a degree, that works out well. And I think when you sort of look at the 380 businesses that we're able to fund with cash, some of them with stock, that we're able to get from some large-scale corporates and blue, I think stock, some of them listed on the stock exchange, that were able to recover and get their businesses going again. But, from that data as well, what we then analyze, or so at the time, what we then analyzed and looked at is that from the 380, we still had about 880 individuals that had applied for support, and we couldn't support those particular individuals. And I mean, some of them, I think about 80 of them had indicated that they won't be able to recover, none whatsoever. So to them, recovery sort of looked like, going back in small scale. Some of them went back into formal employment to look at, could they potentially get into formal employment and the sort.
Yeah, if you've never lived in a township, perhaps you can't even imagine how looting spreads that rapidly. For someone who speaks particularly to businesses that are operating in the township, explain to a South African that is perhaps living in a rural setting or in a suburban urban setting, just how quickly the numbers start to swell in a township when we're seeing an incident like looting. Because certainly on this day, three years ago, there wasn't an expectation that 4 days later the looting would still continue, because unfortunately townships have seen these events before.
No, definitely. I mean, an interesting data piece I was sort of looking at was the data from the SAPS, right? That was unpacking that between January and the end of March, for the first quarter of the year, there were over 2,000, I think it was 2,500 protests across the country. That would mean that, if you're sort of forecasting at the end of 2024, you would have had 12,000 to 14,000 protests that are recorded as well, because there could have been others that aren't recorded, that are taking place across the country. That in itself is a melting pot of what could potentially happen again. And I think when you sort of then unpack how this could potentially happen, I mean, you sort of look at in a household where you could potentially have out of 12 individuals that occupy that household, you potentially have 2 individuals that are in full-time stable employment. That then in itself is a melting pot, because I mean, if you go now into the townships, you have young, bright, minds that are prowling the streets, walking up and down with no plan, with no movement. So when things like that happen, for it to spread becomes the easiest. And I think the lay, different from rural communities where your neighbor, ule pansi, who's a couple of meters away and there's a far good gap. This is a townships in terms of their layouts as well. They're congested, so we almost like pack sardines, one on top of the other. And for any calamity, for any riot to sort of spread is the easiest thing. You don't even need to send a WhatsApp broadcast group because we're so congested, right? So the moment I hear something happening, I jump onto it because it's right next to me and there's a ripple effect and dominoes. It spreads across the room.
Yeah, and in moments.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, Bulelani, you, of course, work with the Township Entrepreneurs Alliance, helping to support businesses that are in our townships. What's the lesson that we learned from 2021 in order to protect those businesses that, for decades have tried to support our communities?
You know what? I think for me, having worked with over 80,000 township entrepreneurs over the past 9 years, and I guess now we are national, right? I mean, when you look at the fact that South Africa has got 532 plus townships, we cover 2/3 of that with various programs that we run. I think what's been very apparent is that we don't lack in terms of creative ingenuity and open and coming up with these amazing ideas. But for any individuals out there who's looking to support, or any large-scale corporates that are looking to really support, let's create market access opportunities. Now, market access opportunity doesn't mean that a new line item in your budget that you need to that you need to fund. But what we're talking about is look at your current program activities, your marketing activities, your program, your enterprise supply development programs, and look and identify opportunities where you could plug in these entrepreneurs in a meaningful way. The moment you do that, you would have been able to support them in a great way. I mean, just yesterday I was reading about a motor spares group that was almost in every other province and town in the country, that is going into voluntary liquidation, if I'm not mistaken. And that then just goes to show you of the bleak economic state that we're in. But however, the saving grace and the hope in my belief is that support small businesses, because small businesses still have the appetite to create the employment and the economic growth opportunities that we are looking for.
Yeah, and they're the first point of call for vulnerable youths who are looking for opportunities. We're going to leave it there. Bulelani Balabala speaking to us there. He's the founder of the Township Entrepreneurship Alliance, talking to us about how the July 2021 riots impacted the spaza shops in very vulnerable communities.